Hello, my name is Sean Sperry and I am with the IBM Systems Group. In this video I am going to be doing an update for Spectrum Protect for virtual environments and Spectrum Protect Snapshot for the second quarter of 2016. So that is version 7.1.6 and 4.1.6. Now my colleague Trisha Zhang is going to be doing a separate video on the items on the left hand side, which is the server, the client, and the operation center. And what I'm going to be specifically covering are the items on the right hand side, which is Spectrum Protect for virtual environments and Spectrum Protect Snapshot. So just to get started with Spectrum Protect for virtual environments, data protection for VMware 7.1.6. Our development organization is continually adding features to allow you to do operations from the VMware web GUI. And this version 7.1.6, is really not any different. We have really 4 different enhancements at version 7.1.6. From the VMware web GUI, you can now do virtual machine backup. Take a look at the virtual machine backup history. Do some additional operations, or really the same operations from the Datacenter Manage panel. And finally, control data retention and backup inclusion from using tagging with VMware. And really, a lot of these enhancements are designed to allow the VMware administrator to feel more comfortable doing these operations and to be able to do them in an environment that they are familiar with, the vSphere web client. So let's take a look at each one of those one by one. The first one is backup, and you can now, from the vSphere web client, go ahead and initiate a data protection for VE backup. As you can see down here in the bottom, you just go to all data protections, actions, and backup, and you will do a backup of a particular virtual machine. And really, this is the same backup that you would get if you did it from the GUI of data protection for VMware. Backup history. Again, from the vSphere web client, you can go in and for a particular virtual machine, choose monitor and IBM data protection, and as you can see here, you will see a list of backups that have been run against that particular virtual machine. And what's happening here in the background is the vSphere web client is looking at the Spectrum Protect server summary extended database table and pulling the information from that table that contains information about the virtual machine backups. Now there is a small caveat here. What we are looking at here is just the information in the summary extended table. So there is some limitation on that in terms of how long the data is kept, and that is configurable in Spectrum Protect. And there's also a different mechanism for determining how long a virtual machine backup is kept. Right? That is Spectrum Protect policy. So just because you have a record here that it did successfully back up doesn't necessarily mean that the backup still exists, but it is an indication that it was backed up. So moving on to the Datacenter Manage feature, and again, this is the vSphere web GUI, and here we're just looking at the data center, and from this view, again, it's just an additional way to take action on a particular virtual machine, so it allows you to either back it up or restore it. And again, it's just a way to make the VMware administrator more comfortable in doing this in a GUI that he or she is familiar with. Moving on to the next feature, in version 7.1.6, we are going to allow administrators to control virtual machine inclusion and exclusion and retention from the vSphere web client using tags. And basically the way this works is you can attach a tag to a virtual machine that either allows it to be included or excluded from the backup, and also allows you to choose the Spectrum Protect management class that the virtual machine is going to apply to when it's backed up. Here you see information on the retention, and this information is being pulled from the Spectrum Protect server, but just being presented in the vSphere web client so that it's in a user-friendly, readable way for the VMware administrator. Now, in addition to doing it from the vSphere web client, you can also do it from the VMware Power CLI command line. And again, this is something that is just an enhancement to something that already existed in Spectrum Protect. You could always do it from the Spectrum Protect Data Protection for VE command line, but we wanted to give our users a way, our VMware administrators a way to do it that they felt comfortable with. And that's where the tool that they are very used to using is the VMware Power CLI. So that is why we give them that support. This is some information on the specific details of implementing tagging. We have many users of data protection for VMware at previous versions who are already running with the inclusion and exclusion controls on the data mover DSM option file, dsm.opt. So our goal is not to interfere with the way they're running. So in order to use the tagging support in 7.1.6, what you have to do is go to the DSM opt file and turn it on using this tag data mover equals yes option. Then from there you'll need to go ahead and either populate the tags using the vSphere web client or populate the tags using the Power CLI command line. Now you can pre-populate IBM categories and tags using this DSMC set VM tags command when you, or if you choose to use the Power CLI command line. And then as the next steps, just picking the machines to be included and excluded, or picking a particular retention policy will be done using the vSphere Web GUI or the Power CLI. Now finally, there is a command on the data mover, this DSMC backup VM-preview, that will give you information about what is being backed up and what management class it is going to. You could of course also see that information in the vSphere Web GUI, but doing it here is somewhat of a good troubleshooting tool. So here you see we're doing this backup VM-preview command, and you can see that, for instance, on this machine VM-gene, the management class being used is MGMT class 1, and that is coming from a tag as opposed to a data mover dsm.opt option. Now there are some notes and requirements for using tagging with data protection for VMware version 7.1.6. First of all, we do require, because of the use of the API, version 6.0 update 1 or higher of VMware. We're also going to require some additional permissions be set for the account that is used to back up and restore operations. And most of these additional permissions have to do with accessing the tagging in the vCenter server. And then finally down here as the last several notes, there are some restrictions in terms of how you set up data protection for VMware. The vSphere GUI and the data mover must be installed on the same server. On Linux data mover, the default password and username must be used. And so these are options that we think will probably be met by most people who use the wizard to configure data protection for VMware, but I just wanted to include them there in this presentation just so you know that they existed. Finally, there is one additional bullet point down here. If your VM tag data mover option is set to yes, all the tags that are assigned to a virtual machine are backed up and restored during backup and restore operations. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you're using these tags to control, include, and exclude, and also to control the management class, you do want them to be backed up when you back up a VM and restore when you restore a VM. And that does happen with the VM tag data mover option is set to yes. Okay, so that is tagging support for data protection for VMware version 7.1.6 and the GUI enhancements. Now we're going to move on to just a quick review. Back in Q1, we introduced large virtual machine support. Prior to version 7.1.4, we did not back up virtual machines that were larger than 2 terabytes in size, and with 7.1.4 we introduced the ability to back up machines that were 8 terabytes or up to 8 terabytes in size using this VM Max virtual disks parameter. And with the initial release of that, there was some support for specific features and functions that was excluded. And what we wanted to do now in version 7.1.6 is go ahead and add those features into the large virtual machine support. So specifically, what we did at 7.1.6 is we used to use a Spectrum Protect recovery agent for in-guest mounting, and at 7.1.6 we've changed that to always use iSCSI for in-guest mounting. And really what that does is allow us to support both MBR and GPT partition disks that are greater than 2 terabytes, and also support cooperative application backup for Exchange. In the previous release, we did not support cooperative backup application support for Exchange, and with this release we do. So you can back up a virtual machine with an Exchange server on it and get a consistent copy of that data and use all those features that are available with cooperative application support. Now, there is a caveat here. For Windows systems, typically the iSCSI initiator service is installed but not necessarily started. So as you can see, in order for this to work, you'll need to set the Microsoft iSCSI initiator service to automatic so that it's running and you can use this support. There are some performance enhancements that we made at 7.1.6 just so you know that they happen. This is some defaults that have been changed in data protection for virtual environments. In Spectrum Protect for virtual environments, data protection for VMware. We have increased the TCP/I window size, the default from 64K to 512K, and we've increased the VDDK I/O buffer from 256K to 4 megabytes. And these are just settings that we found through testing in our lab improve performance in a majority of cases, so we made the decision to change the default. Continuing on with data protection for VMware 7.1.6. This is just further information about what's supported with Exchange at 7.1.6, and specifically Microsoft Exchange Server 2016. At 7.1.6, we do support backup to a Spectrum Protect server using Spectrum Protect for Mail or data protection for VMware. We do support Exchange Server 2016 using Spectrum Protect Snapshot. And we have added at 7.1.6, as mentioned in the previous slide, this cooperative application support for Exchange, and in particular for Exchange 2016. Now there is a note here about the Mailbox Restore browser. The Mailbox Restore browser provides individual message restore for Microsoft Exchange systems, and that is something that we're still working to deliver for Exchange 2016. So our intention is to bring that out in a later release of the product. Now I have a note down here, and this is really always the best advice too. If you're looking for specific versions that are supported or specific support requirements, just Google the All Requirements document for data protection for VMware or Spectrum Protect for virtual environments, and that will give you all the latest and down to a very granular level of detail, and you can really get a good idea of what's officially supported and what's not officially supported in this particular release, because we're constantly making changes and constantly updating that information. Moving on to database availability groups. The Spectrum Protect for Mail, data protection for Exchange, has supported database availability groups for quite a while now, for several years. And there is a parameter called preferred DAG passive, which allows data protection for Exchange to, when it's backing up Exchange, pick the passive version of an Exchange database if it is good and not corrupted, and only pick up the active version if a passive version is not available. Well, this particular option has now been extended to data protection for VMware Spectrum Protect for virtual environments, so that now even if you're using this cooperative application support with Spectrum Protect for virtual environments, you can include on the data mover this VMware preferred DAG passive. And that really functions in the same way as this preferred DAG passive, except it's working with data protection for VMware as opposed to the native operating system. So what it's going to do is skip the backup for the database that is an active DAG copy on a local VM if it has a healthy passive copy on another machine. And if it doesn't have a healthy passive copy on another machine, then it will pick up the active copy. So essentially what this does is reduces the performance impact of backing up the active database copy on your Exchange servers when you're using this feature. Okay, moving on to Spectrum Protect snapshots, and this is again a reference to a previous version. Back in version 4.1.4, we introduced the ability with Spectrum Protect Snapshot for non-IBM hardware to use this VSS Resync LUNs API to do a instant restore. And basically what that sentence is kind of saying in English is that back in 4.1.4 we introduced the ability to do a hardware assisted restore of Spectrum Protect Snapshot on Windows using this VSS Resync LUNs API for non-IBM devices. Now, There were some limitations in that support as it was introduced at version 4.1.4. First of all, it didn't support clusters, and second of all, there were some issues with running the XIV iSCSI on Windows 2012 with the Microsoft VSS provider. Since this has been released, Microsoft has released several of these updates, KB 3137726 and 28, that have addressed those issues and allow us to provide support for clustered systems and also the XIV iSCSI provider. So if you're in one of those environments and need that particular support, that is now available at 4.1.6. Okay, so moving on to Spectrum Protect Snapshot for VMware. This slide describes, kind of gives an overview of what Spectrum Protect Snapshot for VMware does. It allows you to take a snapshot-based backup of a VMware server and use it as a backup, and optionally offload that snapshot to a Spectrum Protect server for long-term retention. So the way it works currently is when you take a snapshot of a VMware data store, that snapshot is going to be stored on the array for backup protection, and if you choose to optionally offload it to a Spectrum Protect server, the tool will take that snapshot and attach it to an auxiliary ESX host, register that VMware data store, and then run the backup to the Spectrum Protect server of the virtual machines, and then unregister that snapshot from the auxiliary host. Now, there are some restrictions with regard to this whole process and how Snapshot works, and really they revolve around two restrictions. First, the Spectrum Protect offloads are serialized, so they have to run in serial. They cannot run in parallel, or they could not run in parallel at version 4.1.4. And at version 4.1.4, only one auxiliary ESX host can be defined to Spectrum Protect Snapshot for VMware. So what we've done in Spectrum Protect Snapshot version 4.1.6 is remove both of those restrictions, so that now when you're doing the backup to a Spectrum Protect server after you do the snapshot, you will be allowed to run those backups in parallel so you can get more work done in the offloading, or more virtual machines can be offloaded to Spectrum Protect using multiple data movers. Of course, the more data movers you have, the more offloading you can do. So this is going to significantly increase the number of virtual machines that can be supported for offload in Spectrum Protect Snapshot. The other thing we've done in version 4.1.6 is we have allowed you to define in the profile for Spectrum Protect Snapshot multiple auxiliary hosts for offload. And here you see a picture of the script that is defining those auxiliary hosts. We're running it in the advanced mode, and here you can see that you can now define multiple auxiliary hosts. So we basically removed both of those limitations to Spectrum Protect for Spectrum Protect Snapshot data protection for VMware at version 4.1.6. Now, there is a little bit of additional information that you need when you're submitting jobs and you want to use this parallel offload feature. the way you're going to define the schedules to actually do the backup is to, in this scheduling wizard, pick different machines based on whatever criteria you're using. So you're going to create multiple jobs, and you're going to put different sets of machines in those multiple jobs, and you're going to use different data movers for each one of those jobs. And if you do that, when you run the jobs, you will see that the offload to the Spectrum Protect server can then run in parallel. So here you see multiple data movers offloading to a Spectrum Protect server, and here they are, the job for DM and DM run running in parallel. So that completes the enhancements for 7.1.6 and 4.1.6.